the buildings are still standing. Walk past them in any city with a 19th century core, St. Petersburg, Chicago, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, and your eyes move past them the way eyes move past them, the way eyes move past things that have always been there. That is the problem. Familiarity has made them invisible. And invisibility is exactly where a question this size prefers to live. Look again. Tilt your head back. Count the floors. Now ask the question nobody in the official record seems particularly interested in asking. How did they do it? Not the theory. Not the architectural drawings filed in some archive. Not the commemorative speeches delivered at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The actual how. The physics of it. The labor mathematics. The material supply chains. The coordination of a workforce operating in an era of horse-drawn carts, hand-mixed mortar, and, in many places, no reliable electricity whatsoever. Something in that question doesn't add up. And the official explanation, the one printed in textbooks, taught in architecture schools, repeated in museum placards, quietly avoids the part that doesn't fit. This is where the investigation begins. Not with a conspiracy, not with a conclusion, with a specific, verifiable, physical detail that should not exist given the tools and timelines we are told were available. The standard history of 19th century construction is a story of industrial progress. Steam power arrived, rail networks expanded, cities grew, and as they grew, ambitious men with capital and ambition commissioned buildings of increasing scale. The home insurance building in Chicago, completed in 1885, is typically called the first true skyscraper. 10 stories of steel frame construction rising above a city that had itself been rebuilt from near zero after the Great Fire of 1871. We are told this represented a breakthrough, a new technology, newly invented, newly deployed, the birth of something. The official explanation accounts for the structural innovation. It does not adequately account for what sits on top of it. Go to Chicago, stand outside the Rookery Building, completed in 1888. Look at the ironwork and the light court, not the general idea of the ironwork, the specific joints, the way decorative elements interlock at load-bearing intersections. Metallurgists and restoration specialists who have studied those joints have noted, with careful professional language, that the method of achieving them at that scale is not fully understood. That is not a fringe observation. That is the considered position of people whose professional obligation is to understand exactly this kind of thing. The question isn't whether the rookery exists. It does. The question is how the people who built it knew how to build it. There is a problem with the idea of a learning curve, and it is a structural problem, not a rhetorical one. Every major technology in recorded history passes through an awkward adolescence. The photographic record of early aviation is full of machines that barely left the ground, that shed wings, that crashed. Steam engines evolved through decades of visible, documented failure. Early locomotives derailed. Early electrical systems burned buildings. Early photography produced blurry images. The progression from crude first attempt to refined capability is always traceable, always documented, always full of the kind of visible struggle that marks a civilization learning something new. The great building programs of the 19th century do not show that pattern. What they show instead is capability appearing fully formed, not a progression from simpler buildings to more complex ones, with ornamental ambition increasing gradually as technique improved. What we see from almost the very beginning is buildings of extraordinary ornamental density, gargoyles and grotesques integrated into structural corners, egg and dart moldings at every cornice, rusticated base courses in precisely cut stone, terracotta panels depicting foliage, human faces, mythological scenes, not applied afterward as decorative afterthoughts, but designed into the structure from the foundation stage. This raises a technical problem. If you are a civilization inventing these techniques as you go, working at the frontier of what is materially and structurally possible, your buildings would be functional first and ornamental later. The ornamentation would arrive once you had solved the hard engineering problems. Once you had surplus capacity, surplus skill, surplus confidence, that is how new capability expresses itself in architecture. You solve the problem of standing up before you solve the problem of looking beautiful. That is not what we see in the 1880s. What we see is buildings that are maximally ornamental from the moment they appear. And that is not the behavior of a civilization figuring something out. That is the behavior of a civilization that already knows. The Library of Congress was completed in 1897. It contains approximately 160,000 individual pieces of art, mosaic, and sculptural ornament embedded in a building whose construction spanned 11 years. The official documentation describes the ornamental programs as being developed and executed concurrently with construction, in some cases by methods being refined in real time. Consider what that requires. Mosaic work of that complexity demands specialists with years of training, not just in the technical execution of mosaic, but in the design systems, the proportional traditions, the material knowledge of which tesserae cut cleanly and which fracture, which glazes hold under load, which adhesives perform across temperature cycles. You cannot improvise that expertise. You cannot hire it casually. You need the infrastructure of a tradition: workshops, masters, apprentices, accumulated material knowledge, institutional memory. Where did that tradition come from? Where is its paper trail? For almost every major building constructed in the late 19th century, the documentary record of the skilled craftsman who executed the ornamental work is thin in a specific and consistent way. General ledgers record payments to subcontractors. Architects' correspondence mentions ornamental programs in general terms, but the workshops themselves, where they were located, how they were organized, who trained whom, what the apprenticeship structures looked like, what the supply chains for specialized materials were. That documentation is either missing or fragmentary in ways that are statistically unusual given the scale of what was being produced. This is not the same as saying the records were destroyed. That would be one kind of problem. The question is whether they were ever created in the forms that Western bureaucratic systems would recognize as complete documentation. There is a difference between records that were lost and records that were never made, because the knowledge was transmitted through other means, through embodied craft, through hands and eyes and muscle memory passed from a master to an apprentice in a workshop that never generated paperwork, because paperwork was not how that tradition organized itself. What would that look like in an archive? It would look like exactly what we have. Fragments, names without biographies, skills without schools, payments to workers whose origins are not recorded. The evidence doesn't disappear. Only the explanation does. Now consider the coordination problem, because this is where the official explanation begins to buckle under its own weight. In the 1880s and 1890s, there is no internet. There is no rapid global communication. The telegraph transmits words, not blueprints. International mail is slow, frequently lost, and entirely unsuitable for conveying the kind of technical specificity that would allow a craftsman in one city to replicate the work of a craftsman in another. And yet, Melbourne, Australia, 1888. The Rialto building rises 8 stories, its facade a confection of Gothic Revival stonework that would be at home on a medieval European cathedral. Melbourne at this point has been a colonial settlement for barely 50 years. The people who built its first permanent European structures were still alive. Sao Paulo, Brazil, late 80s. Ornate neoclassical buildings with European ornamental programs appearing in a city that by all accounts was still consolidating basic infrastructure. Cairo, Buenos Aires, Shanghai, Bombay. Across 6 continents, within a narrow historical window of roughly 20 years, buildings appear that share not just a general stylistic vocabulary but specific ornamental details, the same proportional systems, the same constructional sequences, the same integration of structure and decoration in ways that imply access to a common source. The official explanation for the stylistic similarity is the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which trained architects from around the world who then returned home and deployed what they had learned. And yes, that explains the formal compositional principles, the preference for symmetry, the classical vocabulary. It does not explain the craft. Because architects design buildings, they do not lay the stone. They do not fabricate the ironwork. They do not carve the capitals. For that, you need craftsmen. And craftsmen are not trained in architecture school. They are trained in workshops and lineages of practical knowledge that span decades. The ornamental craft traditions of the late 19th century are spectacularly, consistently, globally poorly documented. Not in Paris, not in Chicago, not in Melbourne, not in Buenos Aires. Everywhere simultaneously, the record of where these people came from and how they learned what they knew is thin and oddly consistent in its thinness. That consistency is itself a data point. There is a material science problem that the official narrative consistently sidesteps, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Many of the stone elements in these buildings, the carved capitals, The rusticated base courses, the precisely cut voussoirs and arched openings, were produced to tolerances that are, by modern measurement, surprisingly tight. When conservation engineers examine these elements with contemporary laser measurement tools, they find dimensional consistency across hundreds of supposedly hand-carved individual pieces that implies either an extraordinary degree of quality control or a production method that is not fully accounted for by the description of hand carving with period tools. The Indiana limestone used in the Biltmore estate, for example, required each decorative element to fit precisely against adjacent elements cut by different craftsmen, possibly in different locations, and then assembled on site without the ability to make significant on-site corrections. The tolerances involved are measurable. The methods required to achieve those tolerances with the tools officially available in 1889 are not fully demonstrated anywhere in the documentary record. Modern stonemasons who have studied restoration of these elements note, consistently and without sensationalism, that replicating the original production rates, the number of finished decorative units per craftsman per day implied by the construction timeline, is difficult to achieve even with modern pneumatic tools and computer-guided templates. This is not a romantic claim about mysterious ancient knowledge. It is a straightforward observation about production mathematics. The numbers that the official timeline implies do not comfortably reconcile with what we know about the practical limits of hand carving and the relevant materials. The official explanation accounts for the finished result. It does not account for the rate at which the result was achieved. There is another category of evidence that receives almost no attention in formal architectural history, and that is the photographic record of construction itself. Or more precisely, the specific nature of what that record omits. We have thousands of photographs from the 1880s and 1890s documenting the finished facades of major buildings. We have portraits of architects. We have images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, of dignitaries at foundation stone layings, of completed interiors furnished and lit for their inaugural use. What we have in strikingly sparse quantities are photographs of the construction process at the stages that would be most technically revealing: foundation work, structural steel erection, the fabrication and installation of ornamental elements, the scaffolding arrangements that would tell us something about the sequencing of work. The sparseness of construction photography is sometimes explained by the practical limitations of early photography: bulky equipment, slow exposure times, the difficulty of working on an active construction site. These are legitimate constraints, but they apply equally to all stages of construction, and they do not explain why photographs of finished facades are abundant, while photographs of the ornamental installation process, the stage that most defies easy explanation, are disproportionately rare. What survives in the archive is selectively complete in a way that is difficult to attribute entirely to chance. We are left with evidence of outcomes and very little evidence of process, and process is precisely what would resolve the questions that the outcomes raise. At this point in the investigation, a name appears on the maps. Not a fringe source, official cartographic publications, produced by official governments, distributed through official channels. The name is Tartaria, or in some editions, Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. It appears on European maps as late as the early 1800s, designating a vast and poorly defined territory spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific coast of Asia, a region of enormous geographic scope, enormous population, and the Western documentary record, enormous opacity. And then, gradually, it disappears. Not all at once, not through conquest or documented political collapse that generated the kind of historical record such events normally produce. The territory gets subdivided, absorbed into neighboring empires, its name replaced by other names. By the mid-19th century, it has largely ceased to appear as a distinct entity on European maps. It is worth being careful about what this observation does and does not suggest. It does not suggest that Tartaria was a secret empire that built 19th century skyscrapers. That would be a conclusion, and the evidence does not support conclusions of that specificity. What it raises is a different and more careful question. Is it possible that the historical record of whatever existed in that territory has been more incompletely transmitted than we have been led to believe? Is it possible that architectural traditions, engineering knowledge, material sciences developed over centuries in that vast and poorly documented region, traveled through trade, through displacement, through the movement of peoples into the building programs of the 19th century? Is it possible that what we are looking at in Chicago in 1885, in Melbourne in 1888, in Sao Paulo in 1891, is not the birth of a new capability, but the final expression of an old one? The official explanation does not address this possibility. It does not refute it either. It simply does not engage with it. There is a parallel question about the terracotta industry that is worth pausing on, because terracotta is one of the most revealing materials in this entire investigation. Architectural terracotta, the fired clay panels that clad the facades of hundreds of major 19th century buildings, requires a highly specific sequence of technical knowledge. The clay body must be formulated to survive the coefficient of thermal expansion of the underlying structural system. The glaze chemistry must be stable across decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The panel geometry must be designed to drain water without trapping moisture against the structural backing. And the panel shapes themselves, the molded faces, the foliate ornament, the classical profiles, must be produced to tolerances tight enough that adjacent panels, fired independently at high temperature with the inevitable shrinkage that entails, will align precisely when assembled on a building face 40 feet above the street. The American terracotta industry, according to the official record, developed these capabilities in roughly a decade, between the mid-1870s and the mid-1880s. Starting from virtually no domestic production capacity, it arrived at the ability to produce, at industrial scale, glazed architectural panels of extraordinary formal complexity, in time to supply the building boom of the 80s. A decade is a short time to develop an industrial tradition of that sophistication. A very short time. The official explanation for this rapid development typically invokes the immigration of skilled European workers, primarily from England and Germany, where the tradition was more established. And yes, that immigration occurred and was significant. But the question of where the European tradition itself came from and how it achieved the specific technical parameters that 19th century American buildings required retreats into a documentary silence that is now several centuries deep. The knowledge arrived with the workers. Where the workers acquired it is not clearly recorded. Where the workers went after the projects they came for were completed is, in many cases, also not clearly recorded. They appear in the ledgers. They disappear from the archive. There is a pattern in how these buildings are preserved and described that is worth noting. Institutions responsible for maintaining 19th century buildings, historic preservation bodies, architectural schools, municipal heritage agencies, are very good at documenting what exists. The dimensions, the materials, the stylistic affiliations, the names of the architects. This documentation is often meticulous. What is consistently, almost universally absent, is documentation of method, how the specific joints were achieved, how the ornamental programs were executed at scale, how the craftsmen were trained, organized, and supplied. When you ask preservation specialists about these gaps, the answers tend to take a particular form. The methods were improvised, the craftsmen were self-taught, the techniques were invented as needed. These explanations are offered with confidence, but they are not supported by primary evidence. They are inferences, reasonable-sounding inferences, that fill a gap where documentation should exist and does not. There is a difference between an explanation and a description. You can describe the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. It's 178,926 square feet. It's 35 bedrooms. It's banquet hall with a 70-foot oak-beamed ceiling. It's Indiana limestone quarried in a different state and transported by rail on a spur line built specifically for the project. You can describe all of that with precision. What the official record cannot do is explain, with equivalent precision, how approximately 1,000 men without power tools, without modern cranes, without computer-aided design, produced it in 6 years the tolerances that would satisfy a modern structural engineer. The description is complete. The explanation is not. There are traces if you look for them. In isolated communities along old Silk Road corridors, in mountain regions of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, in scattered pockets across Central Asia, there are masonry traditions and decorative practices whose relationship to the formal ornamental programs of the 19th century West has not been adequately investigated. The relationship has not been proven either. What exists is an unexplained proximity, techniques that resemble in specific and non-obvious ways the ornamental vocabulary of buildings whose official construction histories do not account for where the craftsmen came from. Is this a connection? The evidence does not establish one. Is it a coincidence? Possibly. But the coincidences accumulate in uncomfortable ways, and the official explanation which essentially requires you to believe that the same specific ornamental solutions emerged independently across a dozen cities on multiple continents within the same 20-year window. That explanation becomes more strained with each additional data point. Consider what the ornamental tradition requires in terms of inherited knowledge. The egg and dart molding, reproduced on buildings from Chicago to Bombay, is not a simple pattern. It requires understanding of classical proportional systems that were developed over centuries in Mediterranean antiquity, transmitted through the Renaissance, refined through Baroque practice, and then somehow available, fully formed, widely deployed, expertly executed, in cities that had no direct institutional connection to those traditions. The official explanation invokes the Beaux-Arts schools. But schools teach design. They do not transmit the embodied craft knowledge of how to carve. Something transmitted that knowledge. What it was and through what channels it moved remains unexplained. By the early 20th century, the ornamental tradition collapses. The transition to modernism is usually explained in terms of aesthetic evolution. The international style was cleaner, more rational, more honest about what architecture could be, and perhaps that is part of the story. But there is another possibility, and it is not incompatible with the first. By the early 20th century, the craftsmen who knew how to execute the ornamental programs of the previous generation were aging. They were not being replaced. The workshops were closing, the lineages were ending, and if those lineages had their roots in a tradition that had already been disrupted, a tradition whose institutional structures had been severed sometime before the building boom of the 1880s, leaving only its last practitioners still working, then the collapse of ornamental craft in the early 20th century is not just an aesthetic choice. It is the moment when the last of a transmitted knowledge finally runs out. The modernist explanation is not wrong, but it may be incomplete. What looks like a stylistic revolution may also be, in part, an accommodation to a loss. What the evidence suggests, carefully, without overstating what can be demonstrated, is something like this. The great building programs of the late 19th century drew on craft traditions whose origins have not been adequately traced. Those traditions appeared across multiple continents simultaneously, with a consistency that implies a common source. The documentary record of where the craftsmen came from, how they were trained, and what institutional structures supported their work is incomplete in ways that are specific, consistent, and globally uniform. The buildings that resulted from this process display a confidence and ornamental complexity that does not fit the model of a civilization learning something new. And within a few decades, the capability was gone, not evolved into something else, but gone, without a satisfactory explanation for either its arrival or its disappearance. The territory labeled Tartaria on official 19th century maps represents something we have not properly investigated. Not necessarily an empire, not necessarily a unified political entity, but possibly a repository of knowledge, a network of craft traditions, a civilization or confluence of civilizations whose relationship to the built world of the 19th century has been, at minimum, inadequately examined. At maximum, we do not know. The buildings are still there. The ornament is still there. In the cities where it hasn't been stripped or covered, the joints that specialists cannot fully explain are still there. The mosaic work whose methods are not fully documented is still there. The proportional systems whose transmission cannot be traced are still there. What is not there is the explanation, not the description. The description is excellent, thorough, institutionally maintained, but the explanation of how a global ornamental tradition of that complexity and consistency was developed, transmitted, deployed, and then lost within the span of a single century, that explanation does not exist in the official record. And the official record, which is otherwise quite comfortable acknowledging gaps and uncertainties, does not seem particularly troubled by this one. The buildings exist, the capability to build them existed, and then, quietly, without adequate documentation of how it arrived or why it ended, it was gone. The question of what that capability was, where it came from, and what body of inherited knowledge it represented, that question has not been answered. It has barely been asked. The stone is still standing. The knowledge that shaped it is not.